Hi, Todd Martin here with the Walking Code. In this video, I'm going to do a hip action deep dive, meaning I'm going to look at the exact function of the hip joints during various types of walking. For example, walking on flat ground, or walking uphill, or walking downhill. So stay tuned. Remember, if you like this video, please thumbs up, share it, and subscribe. Just for a brief anatomical overview, the hip joints are where my upper leg bones, or the femurs, connect to my pelvic bone. The hip joints have a wide range of motion because they're a ball and socket joint. The hip joints have flexion, where we decrease the angle between our leg and our torso. They have extension, where I increase the angle between my leg and my torso. Then we have abduction, where my leg moves out from the midline. We have adduction, where my leg moves in from the midline. And then we have external rotation, where my hip joint turns out, and internal rotation, where my hip joint turns in. In this video, we're going to focus primarily on hip extension and hip flexion, because those are the two hip actions that we use primarily on a conscious or semi-conscious level when we are moving. The other actions of the hip joints, meaning internal or external rotation, those movements are reflexive, or they depend on the other core actions. First, let's look at walking on flat level ground and how we use the hips. When I walk on flat level ground, there are two phases to the step. The first phase is where I change weight to my forward leg, and the second phase is when I swing through or step forward with my swing leg. Let's look at what we use the hips for during those two phases. In the first phase, where I change weight to my forward leg, what I'm doing is lifting my right leg or my rear leg up, meaning I am flexing the hip as I move forward. I do not need to push off the ground in order to get my weight forward when I'm on flat ground. I can simply lift my leg up as I use my core on the standing leg side to pull my body forward. My right leg or my rear leg hip is simply lifting forward, like I'm pulling my knee up. That's the weight change. Now I need to switch hip actions from my rear leg to my forward leg in order to keep walking forward. The reason for that is that if I keep lifting my rear hip, this is what happens. Nothing. I don't go anywhere. My rear hip has done its action. Now that my weight is on the forward leg, lifting my rear hip does not drive the body forward any further. What I need to do is switch the action to my forward leg hip. Now I'm going to lift the body forward from my forward leg, and you can see now that my left leg is driving that movement, not my right leg. So to review, in the change of weight, I'm lifting my right knee forward, flexing the hip. In the second phase of the step, which is the swing through, I'm lifting my forward leg hip. That completes the forward step. I do not need to push off of the back leg in order to drive my body forward when I'm taking a step on flat ground. I am pulling my body forward from my standing leg, not pushing my body forward from the rear leg. That applies when we're on level ground. Now, as I walk forward, I'm going to start moving up this slope. And what's going to happen is I'm going to get to a point where I'm moving uphill, and now I don't have the energy to pull myself forward any further up the hill because of the slope and the effect of gravity pulling me back. Now is when I need to engage extension of the rear hip in order to get my body to move further forward. So I'm going to back up to level ground. On level ground, I can simply lift my rear leg forward and then step, and lift my rear leg forward and step. Now, you can see continuing to try to lift my rear leg forward is not working to get my body up the hill. This is the point where I need to begin extending the hip, pushing off the ground to get my center of mass up over my standing leg. It's almost like switching gears on a bicycle. I can go from a gear where I'm on flat ground, walking in one way, and when I hit the hill, now I have to switch to a different gear to push myself up the hill. When I move up the hill, now that I've got my weight on the forward leg, now I'm going to engage the standing leg hip to lift the body. You can see there's a difference here. When I lifted the body on flat ground, it actually made me finish the step. On a hill, when I lift the body with the forward leg hip, it just makes me stand up. Now I have to actually extend the standing leg hip in order to complete the step. When I'm on flat ground, there's not a third phase to the step that's necessary. On flat ground, there's phase 1, which is the change of weight, and then phase 2, which is the swing through. On a bigger slope, there are 3 phases. There's the change of weight, which requires extension of my rear hip. Then there's the collection, where I collect my leg underneath me, the swing leg, and then there's the swing through. Let's look again at the 2 phases of hip action when we're walking on level ground, and then the 3 phases of hip action when we're walking up a slope. On level ground, we have 2 phases of hip action. When I change weight, I have flexion of the rear leg hip. When I swing through, I have flexion of the forward leg hip. When I'm on the slope, I have 3 phases. I have extension of the rear leg hip, which is required to get my weight up the slope. Then I have flexion of the forward leg hip, which brings my weight up or lifts my body in a standing position, collects the rear leg, and then I have the 3rd phase, which is extension of the standing leg hip to move my body forward. And then I repeat the process. I use my core to change weight again as this leg is extending. Now I lift, and now I swing through. So 2 phases of hip action when I'm walking on level ground, 3 phases of hip action when I'm walking up a slope. I've had several viewers of my videos ask to clarify why I say we should be using hip flexion during the swing through phase of a step, and other people say we should be using hip extension. Meaning, when we are doing this final phase of the step, the swing through, I'm saying we are using flexion of my standing leg hip, whereas other people are saying we're using extension of the standing leg hip. Why is there that discrepancy? The reason for the discrepancy is if we only use visual clues to examine walking technique, we make the mistake of thinking that this movement is extension of the hip because the leg is extending behind me. But the leg extending behind me is not simply an action of the hip joints. It is an action of the entire core. And there are 3 elements to the core, not just the 1 element of the hips. When we are moving, we have 3 core elements. We have rotation of my thoracic spine, which also includes flexion of the body forwards. We have rotation of the lumbar spine, which also includes tilting the pelvis posteriorly or backwards. And then we have our hip actions. All 3 of those motions together produce what we see as whole body movement. So when I am taking my swing through phase of the step, it appears that my hip is extending out behind me, but what in fact is happening is using my lower abdominal muscles to pull the lumbar spine up, tucking the pelvis, tilting my body backwards, while at the same time now flexing my hip joint which moves the body forward. So again, I have posterior rotation of the pelvis due to the lumbar spine action, which is caused by my lower abdominal motion. And then I have flexion of the hip, which then pulls the rest of the body forward. When you use those two actions together, it just appears like the hip is extending behind you. And in fact, the leg is extending behind you, but it's not a function of extension of the hip muscle. You can demonstrate this a little bit better by looking at what happens if you're stepping forward using flexion of the hip, and then you suddenly actually push your leg back using hip extension. It thrusts you forward in a way that's not normal, smooth walking technique. So instead of describing the hip action as extension or even as flexion, I like to think of the intention of lifting the knee forward or lifting the body forward with the hip. I don't think of pushing back with the hip. I think of lifting forward with the hip. Another way of looking at it is this. When my leg is attached to the ground with weight on it, when I try to flex my hip or pull my leg up, my leg can't come off the ground, so what instead happens is the hip flexion pulls the body forward. A good visual example is, imagine yourself sitting on a chair with wheels on it, and you're trying to pull a table towards you by flexing your arm. If you are heavier than the table, then the table is going to pull towards you by flexing the arm. But what happens, let's say the table is glued to the ground or bolted to the ground. Now when I try to flex the arm to pull the table towards me, what's going to happen is my chair is going to roll towards the table, not the table coming towards me. So when I have weight on the ground and I try to flex the hip or lift this knee up, instead what happens is my muscle, or the psoas muscle here that connects my femur into the lower abdomen, when I try to flex that, instead of lifting the leg up, it is going to pull the upper body forward. That is going to be at the same time my lumbar spine is tucking the pelvis, so the forward pull of the flexion is going to basically, in a smooth way, catapult my body forward, so I get one smooth action of walking forward without extending the hip.